My name's Mike. I'm 35, my wife, Sarah, is 33, and we've been married for 13 years. We met young, fell hard, and built what I thought was a solid life together. We have a daughter, Emma, who's 12 and just starting middle school. Life wasn't perfect, but it was ours, a routine of family dinners, Netflix nights, and weekend trips to the park. Or so I thought. Looking back, I was blind to the warning signs creeping in around the edges. Emma had been struggling with math for months, and Sarah suggested hiring a tutor. That's how Greg came into the picture. He was in his early 40s with that cocky, hip teacher attitude. Friendly enough, but something about him rubbed me the wrong way from the start. Sarah was impressed by him, though, and he came highly recommended by a mom from the PDA, so I didn't argue. Emma's grades needed help, and I trusted my wife to handle the arrangements. Greg started coming over twice a week. It seemed harmless at first. He'd sit at the dining table with Emma, flipping through her textbooks, and Sarah would keep herself busy nearby. I worked long hours and wasn't home much during the tutoring sessions, but when I noticed Greg started sticking around longer than necessary. He'd hang back after the lessons were over, chatting with Sarah about everything from TV shows to random crap I didn't care about. Emma would be upstairs by then, usually playing on her iPad, leaving Greg and Sarah alone. At first, I brushed it off as harmless small talk. But then, the small things began piling up. Sarah started dressing up more, wearing perfume at home, even on days when she wasn't going out. I'd walk in the door, exhausted from work, and find her laughing at some stupid joke Greg made, the two of them looking far too comfortable. One night, I got home late after a miserable day at the office. I found Sarah in the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of wine. She jumped when I walked in, literally flinched like she'd been caught red-handed. "Where's Greg?" I asked, trying to keep my voice even. "He left already," she said quickly, not meeting my eyes. She downed half her wine in one gulp, her hands shaking slightly. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. Something was off. Sarah's flushed cheeks, her too casual tone. I wanted to push her, demand answers, but I held back. Maybe I was overthinking it, I told myself. Maybe I was just tired and stressed. But that night, as I lay awake next to her, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was very, very wrong. That night marked the beginning of the end, even if I didn't fully realize it at the time. Sarah's behavior only grew stranger after that. She started looking at her phone more, like a lot more, and she'd get this tight-lipped smile every time a notification popped up. If I asked what she was laughing at, she'd brush it off. "Just a meme," she'd say, or group chat with the moms. She wasn't exactly lying, but something about the way she dodged eye contact made my stomach twist. Then there was Greg. He started showing up more often than scheduled. "Emma needed extra help this week," Sarah explained casually, as if it were no big deal. And maybe it wouldn't have been, if Greg didn't seem to be hanging around just as much for Sarah as for our daughter. I'd come home to find them sitting together in the living room, wine glasses on the table, with Emma nowhere in sight. Once, I overheard Sarah giggling at some story Greg was telling, her laugh way too high-pitched and flirty. It wasn't the laugh she gave me anymore. I started to feel like an outsider in my own home. Every time I tried to talk to Sarah about it, about Greg, about how distant she'd been, she'd flip the script on me, calling me paranoid or accusing me of not trusting her. "He's just Emma's tutor," she'd say, rolling her eyes. "You're being ridiculous." But I wasn't ridiculous, was I? The nagging feeling in my gut told me otherwise. One Saturday, I came home early from running errands. Sarah didn't expect me back yet, so when I walked through the door and saw Greg leaning against the kitchen counter, too close to Sarah, they both froze like deer in headlights. Sarah was laughing, but it died in her throat the second she saw me. "Oh, Mike," she said, her voice a little too loud. "Greg just stopped by to go over Emma's progress." I stared at them both, Greg looking awkward as hell, his hands stuffed in his pockets. Emma wasn't even home. She was at a friend's house for the day. What kind of progress was he going over without her? Right? I said slowly, not buying it for a second. I didn't make a scene. Not yet. But when Greg practically bolted out the door like his ass was on fire, I turned to Sarah and said, "Why was he here when Emma's not?" "He was just being thorough," she replied, too quickly. Her smile was forced, and I could see the guilt flicker across her face, even if she tried to mask it. You're reading too much into this. But I wasn't. Something was definitely happening, and I was done ignoring it. I knew something was off that night. Greg left like he always did, acting casual as hell, and Sarah wasted no time getting ready to go out with a friend. She pulled on a dress, so tight it might as well have been painted on, her hair and makeup done like she was hitting some high-end club. I watched her spray on perfume, my favorite one, no less, like I wasn't sitting there piecing it all together. She didn't even try to tone it down. She just smiled and left, probably thinking I was the same clueless idiot I'd been for months. The second the door shut, I grabbed my keys and followed her. My hands gripped the wheel so tight, I thought I'd snap it in half. Every turn she took, every street light she passed, my stomach tightened like a vice. When she finally pulled into a dingy little apartment complex across town, I parked far enough away to stay unnoticed, but close enough to watch her walk straight to one of the units. No hesitation. No looking back. She knew exactly where she was going. I sat there for a minute, my heart pounding, my brain screaming at me to turn around, to just let it go. But I couldn't. Not after everything. I got out of the car and headed for the apartment. The voices hit me before I even reached the door. Her voice, all sweet and giggly, and then his Greg, that smug prick, laughing like he didn't have a care in the world. My blood boiled as I pushed the door open without knocking. It wasn't even locked. Dumbass. And there they were, sitting on the couch like it was their goddamn honeymoon. Sarah had her hand on Greg's thigh, leaning into him like a lovesick teenager, while his arm was wrapped around her shoulders like she was his prize for a job well done. They didn't even notice me at first, too busy whispering and grinning like two horny teenagers. It was disgusting. When they finally saw me, the air in the room changed so fast it was almost funny. Sarah's face went ghost white, her jaw dropping like she couldn't believe I'd found her. Greg? That pathetic excuse for a man just froze, his hand lingering on her back like he was too clueless to let go. I didn't say a word. I just stood there, staring at them, letting the silence stretch out until they looked like they wanted to crawl out of their own skins. Sarah started to stammer something, but I wasn't interested in hearing it. The image was burned into my brain. Her, Greg, and the cheap perfume she'd wasted trying to cover up the fact she was having an affair with her daughter's tutor. There was no coming back from this. Not for her. Not for us. And especially not for him. I didn't need her to explain. The image was burned into my brain. My wife, dressed like she was auditioning for some cheap soap opera, draped over Greg like he was the goddamn king of the world. The smell of her perfume, my perfume, mixed with whatever cheap cologne that asshole was wearing. It made me sick. Sarah scrambled to her feet, nearly tripping over her heels, her face twisted into some pathetic mix of shock and guilt. Greg just sat there like the coward he was, frozen, his hands still hovering in the air where Sarah had been a second ago. I could feel the rage bubbling up, hot and uncontrollable, but I didn't give either of them the satisfaction of yelling. Not yet. What the hell is this? I finally said, my voice low and calm, the kind of calm that unnerves people because it's right on the edge of exploding. Sarah began stammering, spouting some excuse about how it wasn't what it seemed, but I didn't care. My eyes were locked on Greg, who was still sitting there like a deer in headlights. You, I said, taking a step closer. What's your excuse, huh? What the hell are you even doing here? He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Just a pathetic little gasp, like he'd forgotten how to speak. That was all I needed to see. The guy had no spine, no balls, and sure as hell no excuse. I turned to Sarah, who was already in full waterworks mode, tears streaming down her face as she begged me to let her explain. Explain what? How she'd betrayed me with our daughter's tutor behind my back. How she'd been sneaking out of the house like a horny teenager while I was busting my ass to keep our family together. You've got nothing to say that I want to hear. I spat, my voice shaking with anger. Pack your things. We're done. She broke down completely then, sobbing and mumbling something about how it was a mistake, how she didn't mean for it to happen. Meanwhile, Greg had finally found his voice, stammering something about how he never wanted to cause trouble, and that it just happened. Just happened? I barked, finally letting some of my rage spill over. You think this just happened by chance? You think being with a married woman, a mother, was some accident? Get out of here before I lose my temper. Greg didn't need to be told twice. He practically tripped over himself bolting for the door, leaving Sarah behind to deal with the fallout. She sank onto the couch, her head in her hands, still sobbing like her tears would fix anything. I stood there for a moment, staring at her, the woman I'd built 13 years of life with, and felt nothing but disgust. She destroyed everything. And for what? Some greasy, two-bit tutor who didn't even have the balls to defend her? Without another word, I turned and walked out, slamming the door behind me. If she wanted to throw away our marriage, fine, but she wasn't going to take me down with her. I got in my car, slammed the door, and sat there gripping the steering wheel, my knuckles white. My entire body was vibrating with adrenaline, my mind replaying what I'd just walked in on. Sarah draped over Greg like he was some prize, her tears and excuses after the fact, his cowardly little face as he ran out like the rat he was. It all kept cycling in my head, each rotation making me angrier than the last. I punched the dashboard. Hard. The pain shot up my arm, but it didn't stop the roar of anger bubbling up from my chest. 13 years of marriage, of building a life together, of putting up with her moods, her quirks, her dreams, and she threw it all away for that guy. A goddamn math tutor. I pulled out of the parking lot, the tires screeching as I floored it onto the main road. I didn't know where I was going. Home? Maybe, or just far enough away to think. My mind was too clouded to care about anything except the betrayal clawing at my chest. Every mile I drove felt like another hammer to the coffin of our marriage. And then it hit me. Emma. My hands tightened on the wheel, and my stomach dropped. How the hell was I supposed to explain this to our daughter? The tutor she trusted, the one who'd been helping her for months, had been having an affair with her mom behind my back. My chest burned with guilt, not just for what Sarah had done, but for how clueless I'd been. I was supposed to protect Emma, to give her stability, and instead, I'd let this disaster happen under my own roof. The thought of facing her, of having to explain why Greg wouldn't be coming around anymore, made me feel sick. What the hell could I even say? That her mom had chosen some sleazy asshole over her family? That everything Emma thought she knew about us was a lie? I slammed the brakes at a red light, my hands trembling as I gripped the wheel. My mind raced, replaying every fight, every weird little moment over the past few months. It all made sense now. The late nights, the extra care Sarah took with her appearance, the distance between us. I'd ignored it, written it off as stress or routine, because I never thought she'd go this far. But she had. The light turned green, and I forced myself to keep driving, one hand on the wheel, the other wiping at my face as the emotions started to hit all at once. Anger, sadness, humiliation, they all tangled together in a sick knot that made it hard to breathe. I didn't even notice when I pulled into our driveway. I sat there in the dark for what felt like hours, the engine ticking as it cooled. Part of me wanted to walk inside, to act like everything was normal for Emma's sake, but I couldn't. Not yet. Instead, I leaned my head back against the seat and stared at the ceiling, my mind still racing. 13 years. All for nothing. Sitting in the car outside my house, the weight of everything pressed down on me like a goddamn boulder. The betrayal, the lies, the audacity of it all. It was suffocating. My chest felt tight, my stomach churned, and my hands were still shaking from the rage that hadn't fully subsided. The house, quiet and dark, felt like a mockery of everything it was supposed to represent. It wasn't a home anymore. It was a shell, hollowed out by Sarah's choices. I killed the engine and stepped out, the cold air biting against my face as I trudged to the front door. Inside, everything was eerily still. The usual warmth, the comfort of familiarity, was gone. The walls seemed closer somehow, like they were closing in on me, suffocating me further. I kicked off my shoes, threw my keys on the counter, and went straight to the fridge, grabbing a beer and twisting it open with more force than necessary. The kitchen felt like a foreign place, a stage where happy moments had been acted out under false pretenses. The table where we'd shared meals now felt like a lie. The counters, the appliances, the cabinets, they all mocked me with their normalcy. I tipped the beer back, the bitter liquid doing nothing to wash away the bile rising in my throat. The rage I'd managed to swallow on the drive home bubbled back up, hot and uncontrollable. My eyes darted to the pictures on the wall. Family photos, smiling faces frozen in time, each one a slap to my face. Every frame told a story that was now nothing but fiction. A happy family, a loving couple. Lies. All of it. The sound of a creak on the stairs pulled me out of my spiral. I froze, my body tense as I looked toward the hallway. It was late. Too late for anyone to be awake. For a moment, I thought about what I might say, what kind of excuse I'd have to conjure up, but the thought passed as quickly as it came. I didn't have it in me to spin the truth. Not even a little. I forced myself to stay still until the house returned to silence, the stairs no longer creaking. The adrenaline in my veins refused to settle, so I threw the empty bottle in the trash and stood there, gripping the edge of the counter until my knuckles went white. My breathing was shallow, uneven, and the tension in my chest wouldn't go away. There was no saving this. Whatever Sarah and I had was gone, shattered beyond repair. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train, but underneath it, something else began to form. Clarity. There was only one path forward now. I wasn't going to fight to keep something that was already dead. I wasn't going to beg for answers or forgiveness. She'd made her choice, and now I had to make mine. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts, landing on my lawyer's number. It was late, and I knew there wouldn't be a response until morning, but that didn't matter. The decision had already been made. I typed out a message, hit send, and let the phone fall to the counter. It was over. The life I thought I had, the family I thought we'd built, it was all gone. But as the anger and pain swirled together, one thing became crystal clear. I wasn't going to let her drag me down with her. This was the beginning of the end, and for once, I felt like I had control of what came next. The kitchen felt like a battlefield, and I was losing before it even started. I sat at the table, staring at a mug of coffee I couldn't bring myself to drink. It had gone cold hours ago, but that was the least of my problems. I hadn't slept. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Sarah and Greg. The couch, her hand on his leg, his arm around her like he owned her. My mind replayed it on an endless loop. I heard Emma's footsteps on the stairs before I saw her. My stomach twisted into knots as she walked into the room, rubbing her eyes, still in her pajamas. She went straight to the pantry for cereal, moving through the motions like it was just another morning. For her, it probably was. She had no idea the bomb I was about to drop on her. She sat at the table with her bowl, and I just sat there, staring at her. I didn't know how to start. I'd spent the whole night trying to figure out the words, but now that she was here, nothing felt right. How do you explain to your kid that their mom destroyed everything? How do you even begin? I took a breath and forced myself to speak. My voice sounded weird to my own ears, tight, strained, like it didn't belong to me. I started with the basics, trying to explain that there were problems between me and her mom. I avoided using Sarah's name because it hurt too much to say it out loud. I kept it vague at first, but I couldn't dance around the truth forever. Eventually, I had to say it. Her mom had done something wrong, something that broke our family. Emma froze. She didn't cry at first, just stared at me with wide, disbelieving eyes like she couldn't process what I was saying. I could see the gears turning in her head as she tried to connect the dots. Her cereal sat untouched. Her little hands clutched the edge of the table like it was the only thing keeping her upright. When the tears started, they hit all at once. She looked so small sitting there, her face buried in her hands as she cried, her shoulders shaking. It felt like someone had taken a sledgehammer to my chest. I wanted to say something to make it better, but what the hell could I say? Nothing I said could fix this. I got up and moved around the table, kneeling beside her and wrapping her in a hug. She melted into me, crying against my chest, and I just held her. I wanted to promise her everything would be okay, but I didn't know if it would be. What I did know was that I wasn't going anywhere. No matter what happened with Sarah, I wasn't going to let Emma feel like she was alone in this. Her sobs finally started to slow, but she stayed close, her little hands clutching my shirt. I stroked her hair, trying to keep it together. I couldn't cry in front of her, no matter how much I wanted to. She needed me to be strong, and I couldn't let her down. The kitchen was quiet again, except for her sniffles. I sat there holding her, staring at the family photos on the wall. The ones where Sarah and I were smiling like we had it all figured out. They felt like a joke now. Fake. Like a bad dream I couldn't wake up from. But this wasn't about Sarah anymore. This was about Emma. Whatever happened next, I had to make sure she was okay. I'd figure the rest out later. For now, all I could do was hold her and hope it was enough. Emma stayed curled up against me for what felt like forever, her sobs gradually quieting until it was just the occasional hiccup or sniffle. I didn't move, didn't speak. There wasn't anything I could say that would fix this, and honestly, I wasn't even sure where to start. All I could do was be there, holding her, trying to absorb some of her pain, even though my own was already too much to bear. Eventually, she sat back a little, her face red and blotchy, her eyes swollen. She didn't look at me, just wiped at her cheeks with the back of her hands, sniffling. My heart broke all over again seeing her like that. She shouldn't have to deal with this. She was just a kid, and I'd failed her. Maybe not directly, but I let it happen. I didn't see the signs, didn't stop it before it got this far. That guilt was going to eat at me for a long time. I sat back against the cabinet, pulling in a deep breath. My head was pounding, and I felt like I'd been punched in the gut repeatedly. Still, I had to say something. I couldn't leave her hanging, wondering if her world was falling apart completely. I'm not going anywhere, I told myself more than her. But the words were meant for her ears too. I had to make sure she knew I was there, that I wasn't leaving her to deal with this mess alone. She nodded a little, but didn't say anything. Her silence felt like a dagger, but I didn't push. She was processing, trying to make sense of something that didn't make sense. Hell, I was still trying to do the same. The house felt eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that wasn't comforting. The walls seemed to close in around us, reminding me of everything we'd lost, everything that was slipping through my fingers. The life Sarah and I had built together, the family we'd promised each other. It was all ashes now. I got up slowly, my legs stiff from sitting on the floor. Emma stayed where she was, hugging her knees to her chest. I couldn't blame her. I wanted to curl up in a ball too, but I didn't have that luxury. She needed me to keep it together. I reached down, ruffled her hair lightly, and then headed to the sink. I poured out the coffee that had gone cold and rinsed the mug, the sound of water breaking the suffocating silence. My hands shook as I set the mug on the counter. I felt empty, like a shell of myself, but I didn't have the time to wallow. Emma came first now. She always had, but now it was different. She was the only thing that mattered. I glanced back at her, still sitting on the floor. I knew this was just the beginning. She was going to have questions about her mom, about Greg, about what came next, and I was going to have to answer them, no matter how hard it was. But for now, I let her have this moment. She deserved at least that much. The rest of the morning dragged on in silence. Emma eventually stood up from the floor and went to sit on the couch in the living room, curling up under a blanket like she was trying to shield herself from the world. I didn't push her to talk. I could tell she was barely holding herself together. So was I. I sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at my phone, scrolling through contacts I didn't have the courage to call yet. The lawyer I'd texted the night before had responded. Short, professional, a promise to set up a meeting. Seeing it made my stomach churn. This was real now. The end of everything Sarah and I had built. And then there was Emma. I couldn't get her face out of my head, the way her whole world shattered in a matter of minutes. The thought of her sitting upstairs every week, thinking Greg was helping her, while her mother was tearing our family apart. It made me want to punch a hole in the wall. Eventually, I heard her stir in the living room. Her little feet padded back into the kitchen, and she sat across from me, her blanket still draped around her shoulders. She looked at me for a long moment, her face pale, her eyes red and swollen. And then she asked the question I'd been dreading. What happens now? Her voice was small, barely above a whisper, but it hit me like a truck. I felt like I couldn't breathe for a second, but I forced myself to stay calm. I had to answer her, no matter how much it hurt. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, trying to figure out how to put it all into words. Things are going to change, I said finally, keeping my voice as steady as I could. But no matter what, I'm here. That's not going to change. She nodded slowly, her gaze dropping to the table. She was quiet for a long time, and I could see her trying to piece things together to make sense of something that didn't make sense at all. Finally, she asked, "Is Mom coming back?" My chest tightened, but I kept my face neutral. I couldn't lie to her. She deserved the truth, even if it hurt. "I don't know," I said, and that was the only honest answer I could give her. "But we're going to figure this out. Together." She nodded again, biting her lip, but her tears came back anyway. She tried to wipe them away quickly, like she didn't want me to see, but I noticed. I always noticed. I moved around the table and wrapped her in a hug, and she clung to me like I was her last lifeline. I held her tight, my hand gently stroking her hair, and I made a silent promise to myself. No matter how messy this got, no matter how much it hurt, I wasn't going to let her feel alone. I couldn't fix what Sarah had done, but I could be there for Emma. I could make sure she knew that she still had one parent who wouldn't let her down. She deserved at least that much. The call to the lawyer wasn't long, but it was brutal. Every word felt like another nail in the coffin of my marriage. As I explained what happened, the betrayal, the lies, the disgusting scene I'd walked in on, the lawyer stayed calm and professional. I wasn't. My voice shook with anger, my words sharp enough to cut glass. I wanted this done. I wanted Sarah out of my life, and I wanted her to feel every ounce of the pain she had inflicted on me and Emma. I wasn't playing fair anymore. I'd spent years being the good guy, the understanding husband. That man was gone. In his place was someone who wanted justice, who wanted Sarah to pay for every second of humiliation and heartbreak she'd caused. She hadn't just cheated, she'd ripped apart our family, and she wasn't going to walk away unscathed. The prenup came up quickly. Thank God, I'd listened to my father's advice all those years ago. Sarah had rolled her eyes when I brought it up back then, making snide comments about how it was unnecessary because we'd last forever. What a joke. Now, that piece of paper was the only thing keeping her from taking me for half of everything I'd worked my ass off to build. The lawyer laid it out. Sarah had violated the terms of the agreement. Infidelity was a deal breaker, and the evidence was airtight. She wouldn't get the house. She wouldn't get a dime more than what she came into the marriage with, which wasn't much. And custody? After what she'd done, I wasn't about to let her near Emma without a fight. I wanted primary custody. Hell, I wanted full custody, but I knew the courts would never make it that easy. When I told Sarah about the divorce, I didn't bother being gentle. She walked into the house 2 days later, looking guilty as hell, but still trying to play nice, acting like we could somehow talk this through. As if the image of her with Greg wasn't seared into my brain forever. "We're done," I said, my voice flat, my eyes burning into hers. She froze, her mouth opening like she was about to protest, but I didn't let her. I slammed the papers down on the counter between us, the sound echoing in the quiet kitchen. Her face went pale as she looked at the stack of documents, her hands trembling slightly as she picked them up. I could see the gears turning in her head, the realization hitting her. This wasn't a fight she was going to win. "You cheated on me," I said, my voice rising, all the rage I'd been holding back boiling to the surface. "You destroyed this family. You don't get to play victim now." She stammered something about being sorry, about wanting to fix things, but I wasn't listening. Sorry didn't mean anything to me anymore. Sorry wasn't going to undo the damage she'd done. I told her to sign the papers, to pack her things, and to get out. I didn't care where she went, as long as it wasn't here. The days that followed were chaos. Sarah cried, begged, screamed, sometimes all in the same breath. She accused me of being cruel, of giving up too easily, but I didn't flinch. I was done with her lies, her excuses, her crocodile tears. I'd spent too long bending over backward to make her happy. And for what? So she could stab me in the back? Not anymore. When she finally signed the papers, it felt like a victory. A bitter, hollow victory, but a victory nonetheless. She packed her things and left the house that same day, her face a mess of tears and frustration. I didn't feel sorry for her, not even a little. She'd made her bed, and now she could lie in it. As the door slammed shut behind her, I stood in the quiet house, the silence almost deafening. It wasn't over yet. There were still custody battles to fight, still pieces of my life to pick up. But for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Freedom. The silence in the house after Sarah left wasn't peaceful. It was loud, almost suffocating. Every room felt haunted by her presence. Every piece of furniture a reminder of the life we had built and she had torched. I stood in the living room, staring at the door she had slammed behind her, the echo still ringing in my ears. It wasn't victory I felt. It was rage. Blinding, searing rage that threatened to consume me whole. I wanted to break something, to throw every picture of us, every stupid little memento she'd left behind, and smash it into 1,000 pieces. Instead, I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms, so hard they almost drew blood. I wasn't going to let her win by losing control. She'd taken enough from me. She wasn't taking my dignity, too. The next few days were a whirlwind of legal meetings, custody preparations, and dealing with the fallout. Sarah tried to fight, of course. She claimed she deserved half the house, half the savings, half of everything, even after the prenup was thrown in her face. I knew she was desperate, grasping at straws because she realized too late how badly she'd screwed up. But the law was on my side, and the evidence I had wasn't just a nail in her coffin. It was the whole damn hammer. Still, that didn't stop her from trying to manipulate me one last time. She called late one night, her voice thick with fake remorse, asking if we could talk things over for Emma's sake. The nerve of her, using our daughter as a pawn after what she'd done. I didn't yell, didn't lash out. I simply told her the same thing I'd told her the day she left. You made your choice. Now live with it. In court, her lawyer tried to paint her as a mother who made a single mistake but was still fit to co-parent. A mistake? That wasn't a mistake. That was a choice. A calculated betrayal that lasted for months, if not longer. I sat there in the courtroom, stone-faced, as Sarah played the heartbroken wife, tears streaming down her face, like she hadn't been sneaking around with her daughter's tutor in my house while I worked late to keep a roof over our heads. The judge didn't buy it. The evidence was too damning. The affair, her absence during family responsibilities, her blatant disregard for Emma's emotional well-being. I walked out of that courtroom with primary custody and the house, leaving Sarah with nothing but her crocodile tears and whatever Greg had left to offer her. If he even stuck around, knowing him, he'd probably already moved on to his next client. After the ruling, Sarah confronted me in the parking lot. Her face was a mixture of anger and desperation, her voice sharp as she accused me of being heartless, of turning Emma against her. I stood there, letting her rant, the venom in her words bouncing off me like rubber. I'd spent years letting her manipulate me, letting her make me feel small to inflate her own ego. Not anymore. When she finally paused, out of breath and out of excuses, I looked her dead in the eye. This isn't about you, I said, my voice low and steady. It's about Emma. She deserves better than what you gave her. She tried to say something else, but I turned and walked away before she could finish. I wasn't interested in her excuses or her guilt. She'd made her bed, and now she could lie in it, alone. Back home, I stood in the doorway for a moment, taking it all in. The house still felt like a shell, but now it was a shell I could rebuild. I walked into Emma's room and found her sitting on her bed, reading. She looked up at me, her eyes wide, searching for some kind of reassurance. I gave her a small smile, sitting beside her and pulling her into a hug. We're going to be okay, I told her, more to convince myself than anything. And for the first time, I believed it. Not because the pain was gone. It wasn't, and it wouldn't be for a long time. But because I wasn't trapped anymore. I wasn't tied to someone who only cared about herself. I could breathe again, even if it was shallow at first. The divorce wasn't just the end of my marriage. It was the beginning of something new, something better. And as I sat there with Emma, holding her close, I made a vow to never let anyone rip apart our lives like that again. Sarah had taken enough from me. From here on out, it was about rebuilding. Not for me, but for Emma. She deserved that much, and more. Life after the divorce wasn't easy, but it was steady. Emma and I had started to rebuild, piece by piece, creating something solid out of the wreckage Sarah had left behind. The pain of betrayal dulled with time, though it never fully disappeared. It lingered like a scar, a reminder of what I'd been through and how far I'd come. Sarah stayed out of our lives for the most part. She saw Emma occasionally, but the visits were awkward and strained. Emma wasn't the same around her anymore, and Sarah knew it. I could see the guilt eating at her every time she looked at Emma, but that wasn't my problem anymore. She'd made her choices, and I had no intention of cleaning up her messes. Then, about a year after the divorce was finalized, I heard through mutual friends that Sarah had married Greg. I laughed when I first heard it. Of course she did. She'd burned down her entire life for that guy. What else was she going to do? But the laughter didn't last. The thought of Greg being a stepfather to Emma turned my stomach. Luckily, Emma had made it clear she wanted no part of that life, and Sarah didn't push. At first, the news of their marriage didn't mean much to me. I'd moved on, and as long as Sarah kept her drama away from Emma and me, I didn't care. But it didn't take long for cracks to appear in their picture-perfect love story. It started with whispers, comments from old friends who still kept tabs on Sarah. Apparently, Greg's health had taken a sudden turn for the worse. He'd been diagnosed with a serious illness, something aggressive and unforgiving. It didn't surprise me. The guy had always struck me as the type who'd burn out fast, living off charm, and not much else. Still, I didn't feel much beyond a detached sense of irony. The man who helped destroy my family was now watching his own life unravel. Sarah, I was told, was devastated. She was by Greg's side through his treatments, trying to salvage the life she'd thrown everything away for. Part of me wondered if she'd ever stop to think about what she'd lost. Her family, her stability, her respect. All for a man who was now too sick to enjoy the life they'd dreamed up together. It didn't take long for Greg's illness to win. Within months, he was gone. The mutual friends who told me about his death said Sarah was heartbroken. I didn't have much to say about it. I didn't feel joy or satisfaction. I didn't even feel pity. All I felt was a strange, hollow sense of finality. Sarah had gambled everything on Greg, and in the end, she'd lost. The life she traded us for had been ripped out from under her, leaving her alone with nothing but memories and regrets. It was karma in its rawest form, though it didn't bring me the satisfaction I thought it might. It just was. As for Emma and me, we stayed focused on our lives, our future. We didn't talk about Sarah much, and I didn't bring up Greg's death. Emma had already been through enough, and I wasn't going to burden her with Sarah's choices. Our life wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and I wasn't going to let the past take that away. Sarah's story wasn't mine anymore. She'd made her choices, and now she had to live with them. All I could do was keep moving forward one step at a time, building something stronger, something real. Emma deserved that, and so did I. The years passed quietly, and life moved on. Emma grew up faster than I expected, her strength and resilience constantly surprising me. She thrived in school, made great friends, and even started talking about colleges. The pain of Sarah's betrayal faded into the background. Overshadowed by the pride I felt watching Emma become the incredible young woman she was meant to be. Sarah, however, didn't fare as well. At first, I didn't hear much about her after Greg's death. She faded into the periphery of my life, a name that came up occasionally in conversations, but never carried much weight. Her visits with Emma became less frequent, dwindling until they were practically non-existent. At first, Emma was hurt by her mother's absence, but over time, she stopped expecting anything from Sarah. It was as if she'd finally accepted that the woman who had once been her mother was no longer the same person. It was through mutual friends again that I started to hear bits and pieces about Sarah's life. She'd started drinking heavily after Greg died, throwing herself into alcohol like it was the only thing keeping her afloat. The stories were ugly. Bar fights, missed bills, and nights passed out on a couch in some rundown apartment. The woman I'd once loved was unrecognizable, a shell of herself. I didn't feel pity. Not really. Sarah had made her choices, and the path she'd walked down was one she'd built for herself. But I couldn't help but feel a quiet, grim sadness for what she'd become. She'd burned everything good in her life, and now she was drowning in the ashes. The news of her death came on a Tuesday morning, completely unexpected. A mutual friend called me, their voice heavy with discomfort, to let me know that Sarah had passed away. Liver failure, they said. Years of heavy drinking had finally caught up with her, and her body couldn't take it anymore. She'd been alone when it happened. No one even found her until the next day. For a moment, I didn't know how to feel. My first thought was Emma. How was I supposed to tell her? She'd already lost so much of her mother years ago. But this was final. This was a door closing that would never reopen. When I told Emma, I kept it simple. I didn't sugarcoat it, but I didn't dwell on the details either. She sat there quietly, processing, her face unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, almost detached. She made her choices, she said. I could see the hurt behind her words, but there was no anger, no bitterness, just acceptance. I didn't try to push her to grieve in a certain way. Emma had already mourned the loss of her mother a long time ago. This was just a formality, the final punctuation on a story that had ended years earlier. As for me, I didn't feel relief or triumph in Sarah's death. What I felt was a somber kind of closure. She'd taken so much from us, and in the end, she destroyed herself too. It wasn't justice, and it wasn't satisfying. It just was, we didn't attend the funeral. Emma didn't want to go, and I respected her decision. Instead, we spent the day together, talking about anything but Sarah. We laughed, we shared stories, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like the shadow of Sarah's choices had finally lifted. Her death didn't erase the past, but it marked the end of a chapter that had defined so much of our lives. From then on, it was just me and Emma, looking forward, building a life that had nothing to do with the chaos Sarah had left behind. For the first time in years, it felt like we were truly free.